Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to a live reaction edition of the Saints Insider Podcast. Today is Friday, February the 21st, and the Saints have a defensive coordinator. They hired Brandon Staley, or are in the process of hiring Brandon Staley to lead their defense and kind of be Kellen Moore's top lieutenant on that side of the ball. I'm here, Zach Ewing, with Matthew Paris and Luke Johnson, our Times-Picayune beat writers, and Jeff Duncan, one of our New Orleans sports columnists. And these guys are here to react, tell you everything about Brandon Staley that there is to know, and how he might affect the way the Saints roster and the rest of their coaching staff looks like. So let's dig right into it. We'll start with you, Matt. This was the expected outcome. Brandon Staley has a prior connection to Kellen Moore. We've heard his name repeatedly over the last couple of weeks. It took maybe a few days longer than we thought it would, but ultimately the Saints land in the place we thought they would.
It is, yeah. And it's a fascinating dynamic because obviously Staley used to be Kellen Moore's old boss. Kellen Moore was the offensive coordinator with the Chargers. Staley was the coach of the Chargers. Now they reunite, and it's Staley working for Moore. But I'm really interested to see how the transition goes for him becoming back as a coordinator, because the thing about his Chargers defense, they had some smart schemes and some complicated defenses, but they weren't very good defensively, even though they had, a lot of talented players. But the one year he was a coordinator with the Rams, they were like the best in several categories. So I think it's a good hire overall. I just think it might take a little bit of time for the Saints to find the personnel to run this scheme.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I think there's a lot that you said there that we're going to dig more into. Luke, I know you wrote the story that's up on our website right now about Staley, so you've dug into his past a little bit. This hire is not going to be without controversy. He wasn't a very popular coach, not just among Chargers fans, but I think a lot of people thought he failed as head coach of the Chargers. He only has the 1 year as an NFL coordinator, so it's probably not a hire without risk.
I tend not to really look at the head coaching resume when I'm assessing somebody's ability as a coordinator. I think we've seen a lot of people fail in the head coach role who we understand to be generally smart football coaches. Right here. Thank you, Matt. Yeah, there's the most obvious example to anybody here. Dennis Allen was a tremendous defensive coordinator here. He was certainly highly sought after this offseason, despite the fact that he's failed in two places as a head coach. Josh McDaniels has been a very good offensive coordinator, terrible head coach. Vic Fangio, who Brandon Staley, comes from his tree of coaches, was not a very good head coach, is an excellent defensive coordinator. So I just don't think that we can put too much stock into what happened in Los Angeles and look at how that's going to impact his ability to coach the defense here. I think the most interesting part of it to me is how they get the roster to fit what he's looking to do, and just some of the stylistic changes that they're going to make. I don't think they're going to be running nearly as much man coverage as they did under Dennis Allen as they do with Brandon Staley. Obviously the 3-4 has really been his go-to. That kind of changes a little bit when you're running a lot of sub personnel. Teams aren't really in their base a lot anymore. But it is going to change the type of player the Saints are looking for. Yeah, I don't think we're going to necessarily be looking at guys who are 6'6", 280-pound defensive ends and writing, putting a star next to their name and writing Saints anymore. So it's going to be interesting to see how this impacts the way the team goes. But as far as his history and what that means for him as a defensive coordinator, I think you can leave everything that happened in LA in the dust. Even honestly, to me, even the defensive numbers, there's so many other things that go on a head coach's plate that I don't really take that as representative of who he is as a play caller.
Jeff, how about you? What's your reaction to this hire? It's another fresh face, and as Luke said, it's going to create a lot of changes for the Saints, but that's where we're at right now. There's a lot of changes.
Yeah, it kind of fits into the MO of what he's been doing so far as hiring young head coaches. I mean, Staley's what, 40, early 40s, 42, I think.
42.
Yeah, I mean, he might be the oldest coach on the staff. I don't know. it fits in, I think, with the kind of staff he's put together. Staley's an interesting guy. I totally agree with Luke. I mean, I could care less what he did as a head coach. I like the fact that good coaches like Kyle Shanahan and Sean McVay are hiring him. That means a lot. They don't hire bad coaches for the most part. And the interesting thing I've always thought about Staley is that he played quarterback. I mean, he was a college quarterback at Dayton, but all of his background as a coach is on the defensive side of the ball. I've always found that interesting that he was a player on the offensive side, but his coaching background is all defense. I mean, he's coached under Vic Fangio before, which obviously is, that scheme he's very familiar with. So is Kellen Moore. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of scheme he puts in. And I think we've talked about it before. The league has become so multiple on defense that whatever scheme you're in, it's going to be changing so much from down to down on situation. I don't think it's quite as important as it used to be, but certainly the personnel is going to have to be married up to what he wants to do.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And I do wonder, before we kind of dig into some of those details, how serious do you think the Saints were with anybody else? I saw a comment here about Christian Parker. They only made 2 other interviews that were ever made public. Do you think Staley was the guy the whole time, guys?
I mean, I would have to think he was a leader in the clubhouse, but I do think that they did take their time with this one. And like, I don't think they just kind of paid the other stuff lip service. Nussmeier always felt like a guy they were going to be zeroing in on anyways, just because the fact of the matter is he's going to be an OC that is not calling plays. That's going to limit your pool of candidates for that type of position. So I think everybody just was always like, yeah, he's going to be the guy, because it's like they're not going to go out and get this hot shot offensive mind who's not going to be able to call plays. DC was different. That's essentially the second head coach on this team, right? If you're looking at it that way, they're going to be in complete control. I'm sure Staley's going to have a full ability to hire the staff that he wants, and that's not going to be an area that Kellen Moore is going to be spending a lot of time overseeing. So he needed to make this right, which is why I think this one took a little bit longer. Even if he was the guy they really identified early on as somebody that they wanted to work with, I think they had to do their due diligence with this one, which is why it took a little bit longer.
Yeah, and I think it's different than Nussmeier, even the offense with Kellen Moore, because you saw the Saints make hires on the offensive staff before they finalized Nussmeier, whereas you haven't really seen them hire a linebackers coach. You had a defensive line coach. Like they needed to get the coordinator in place first, and that's Staley. But I think it took a little bit of time because they were interviewing other candidates, and I think they did consider some other people too.
And I think in a lot of ways, guys, this is more interesting and intriguing than even the Kellen Moore hire, just because we've seen the same defensive scheme run here for a long time. And, it's been the Dennis Allen scheme forever, it feels like. So in a lot of ways, it feels like when they brought in Kubiak last year, you're going to get something different and a little refreshing, I think, for fans just to kind of sink their teeth into.
Well, to Luke's point earlier, I was actually looking this up as we were talking about the difference in man rate coverage. Under Dennis Allen, the Saints ran man coverage about 33% of the time, which is lower than I would have guessed, but a lot of NFL teams just play zone in general. And with Staley in his 3 years as coach, with the Chargers, it was about 25%. So I think that speaks to Luke's point about we are going to see some differences. I think we are going to see a lot more zones defense. And, yeah.
So very interesting hire. Again, Jeff, you mentioned this, 3 quarterbacks as your head coach and 2 coordinators. I assume maybe that's been done at some point in NFL history, but it has to be pretty rare that you have the head coach, the offensive coordinator, and defensive coordinator all quarterbacks. So let's start digging into this by looking at Brandon Staley's past. And we've mentioned it. He had the NFL's top defense by any measure, by yardage, by points, by third down conversion, by running defense, by passing defense. I mean, the Rams were number 1 in everything. That was during the COVID season of 2020. It got Brandon Staley a lot of buzz. It got him hired across town, well, across the hallway in the other locker room as the Chargers head coach, where he ultimately failed. And a big reason for his failure was his defenses were not up to snuff. So, Luke, you've already kind of said, you say, I'm not worried too much about that. There's kind of two ways to look at it from my perspective. Is like, yeah, he excelled as a coordinator, and maybe that's where he's best suited, and maybe he'll excel here too. But also, as a coordinator, he had Aaron Donald, he had Jalen Ramsey, he had some personnel that made, being multiple and running these different schemes a lot easier than maybe he's going to find it in New Orleans.
Yeah, I don't think you can just completely swipe it under the rug, right? I think there's a reason that it wasn't a defensive coordinator last year, but I do think that there are things that take your attention away as a head coach. And I think there are sometimes some of the issues he dealt with, and he lost Derwin James for a significant chunk of that tenure, and then he could never really figure out what to do with Derwin James, who was good before Staley got there, and then hurt and not good while he was there, and then really good after he left. I think he missed a lot of time with Bosa. They're like some of the significant talented players that he had on his roster, were injured during the time there. So concerning, yes, but I still think that he's the several years he spent under Fangio as an outside linebackers coach, and that was Fangio's spot too. That was where he kind of cut his teeth with the Saints as a linebackers coach. And the 1 year he spent in Los Angeles, I think that to me makes me feel pretty good about this hire. And I kind of put less stock in the time when he was, had other things to worry about beyond the defense.
In a lot of ways too, he's the complete opposite of Kellen Moore as far as how he got to the NFL and, kind of rose up the ranks. I mean, this is a guy you've documented in his story, but came from small colleges and, did it the hard way, kind of rose up the ranks before he finally even got his start in the NFL. Whereas Kellen Moore, of course, just jumped right into it as a position coach with the Cowboys and is a shooting star as a head coach. This guy took every rung of the ladder to get to where he got.
Yeah, no doubt about that. He was a graduate assistant at Northern Illinois, defensive line coach at St. Thomas of Minnesota, associate head coach and D coordinator at Hutchinson, then actually went to Tennessee for a year as a graduate assistant, then surfaced at John Carroll for a year, back to D1 James Madison, then back to James Carroll, and then gets his big break 2017 as the outside linebackers coach for the Chicago Bears. So a super interesting background, obviously had to excel at some of those spots to get those promotions. So but I agree with you guys. And Matt, I don't know if you want to chime in on some of these past stops more than you already have, but obviously a bit of a checkered history, but you do have to have that success to keep moving up.
Yeah, I mean, the Fangio aspect is pretty, I think, telling of maybe what the Saints are looking for. Kellen Moore obviously spent the year with Fangio in Philadelphia this past season. Staley has that history. One of the things I'm interested to hear from Staley once we get a chance to talk to him is, does he think this defense is complicated at all? Because I know, from spending the week with the Eagles when they were here for the Super Bowl, that's something that Fangio said, that he doesn't think his defense is all that complicated. You just have to execute it right. And that a little bit is overblown of how difficult it is to learn this system. So I'll be interested to see what Staley has to think about that, whether, and just in general, Kellen Moore is looking for smart football players. So, I just wonder what the personnel will be like going forward.
Yeah, that's a big question I have. Especially just like the personnel they have in the front. Are they going to need a true nose? Is that going to change Brian Brzez's value to this team? Is Cam Jordan going to have a role at all? Are any of these guys fit? Would they like on the front seven? Or are they going to have to use premium draft assets on like the kind of edge rusher, outside linebacker type? Like Zach Bond, who they let go. I don't know. I think there's a lot of different questions they're going to have to answer about what they're looking for personnel-wise for the defense.
And just because they run a 3-4, I mean, that itself, I think, is a little overblown because when teams go in nickel, it's pretty much
Right.
a 4-3 anyway. You're still having your outside linebackers become the defensive ends in a 3-4, and you just let them rip. But there are, we were on a call. I was on a call with Daniel Jeremiah this week. He hosts like the NFL thing, and his mock draft, he has Mike Green, who's like 6'3". He's a edge rusher from Marshall, but he's not the type of edge rusher the Saints have historically liked. So, I wonder if Staley's philosophy will cause them to change at all.
Yeah, I agree with you on the full blown overhaul of of a defensive front being kind of an antiquated idea, just because of how much time teams spend in nickel and dime. But at the same time, you can still look at teams that are running 3-4, and they look a lot different than what the Saints look like personnel wise. Yeah, and that's the thing that I'm going to come to. Even though they're still going to be running a lot of 4-down fronts and nickel and dime or whatever. There's the Saints wouldn't have had Josh Sweat on their team, or a number of these other guys that you kind of see around the league. TJ Watt never would have been drafted by the Saints, right? So it's just going to open up an interesting avenue for what they're looking for player procurement wise.
Yeah, and that'll be a discussion we'll do in a little bit too. I want to add too. So Staley has traditionally used a 3-4 scheme. Last year, he spent with the San Francisco 49ers, who have used a 4-3 for years. So I don't think it's fair to pigeonhole him as, hey, it's going to be 3-4. He may very well look at the personnel available to him, the Saints salary cap situation, maybe what they get in the draft, and say, okay, we're not going to be able to do this exactly the way I want to do it for a year or two, right? This could be a building process.
Yeah, but I think Matt made a good point though, in that he comes from the Fangio system, and Kellen Moore just spent a year working with Fangio. I think that that's probably going to be what they want to bring in. So
yeah, I would be shocked if they ran a 4-3 after all that.
Yeah,
even the guys that they interviewed, I think we're all 3-4.
Yeah. What do you think, Don?
Yeah, the other thing that's interesting about all that is, Fangio's defensive scheme is being credited widely with, one of the reasons why scoring is down around the league. I mean, they play a lot of 2-deep zone. I can remember back, in the early days, when Breeze and those guys were lighting it up, they were seeing a lot of single high safety looks, and they were able to get deep. I mean, their favorite play was the, all go special, 3 verticals, and they would throw over the top of people right and left. And, of course, when Mahomes came in, he did it with Tyreek Hill. And Vic Fangio, his scheme kind of changed all that. I mean, he gets a lot of credit for changing the way defenses are played in the league. It's almost the defensive version of the McVay-Shanahan offense. So I think this is going to be a little bit of a dramatic change, and I'm kind of excited to see how it plays out. I think they've got a lot of work to do, though, to change the defense. But, we've talked about it before. I think they were going to overhaul this defensive roster anyway. It was getting old. So, in a way, it kind of fits. If you're going to change it out anyway, might as well go with what scheme you want to play. And it certainly seems what Kellen Moore is doing.
And the danger with trying to run Fangio's tree is, not everyone can do it. Fangio is a special defensive coordinator. Who is the guy with the Eagles that they replaced with Matt Patricia? Sean Saleh. He was, I think, running a Fangio type scheme and wasn't successful. There are guys, just like we had this discussion with Kubiak last year. There are guys who have implemented the Shanahan type offense, and whether they don't have the players to do it or they don't have the same X's and O's background. But I think that's what makes Staley a good hire, is because he has at least a track record as a coordinator, albeit one season, of successfully implementing it. So, yeah.
I'm trying to remember. Luke, do you know, did the Saints work against the Chargers out in California preseason? When he was head coach, I'm trying to remember.
I'm pretty sure it was them. It was the 2023,
right? Two years ago, I thought the Saints had practice.
23, they did it in Green Bay. So I think it was
22.
22.
Yeah.
22 was Green Bay. 23 was California.
Yeah, you guys were out there
right?
in 23 because of, wasn't there like a hurricane or something in California?
That's right.
Yeah, right before the preseason game.
That's right. You're right. Yeah, that's all correct.
Okay. Yeah, I thought they worked against him. I can remember that. So that's interesting in a way. And I think I've mentioned before that Staley had a connection to the old staff, I think, with Joe Lombardi. So he's been to New Orleans a lot. It'd be interesting to hear what he has to say about some of those memories as well.
You are watching the Saints Insider Podcast. We are reacting live to the hiring of Brandon Staley as defensive coordinator as Kellen Moore continues to fill out his coaching staff. I'm going to take a quick 30-second break here and be back. We'll dig into some maybe specific personnel moves, coaching staff hires, all that sort of thing, and how we think Brandon Staley and Kellen Moore may work together right after this. Back in 30 seconds.
There's no better place to parlay than Caesars Sportsbook. Parlay Builder gives you all the game day action from all across the league. Multiple games, legs, and props, all in one spot. It's so quick and easy, you can keep your focus on the games and your nachos. Or if you're focusing on one game, remember, you can place your same game parlays live during the action. Caesars Sportsbook, the only sportsbook app with Caesars rewards.
All right, welcome back to the Saints Insider Podcast, Defensive Coordinator Edition, live edition. We were going to meet in person this morning, and we kind of needed the news to drop first before we could do that, and couldn't all get together this afternoon. So here we are. We appreciate you all hanging out with us. Hit the like button, subscribe to our Saints at NOLA.com YouTube channel. You can also read all of these guys' stuff at NOLA.com/Saints and read up all about this. We'll be writing a lot about Brandon Staley and his staff, and of course about personnel moves with the Combine next week and the new league year starting in just a couple of weeks after that. We mentioned this a little bit. If the Saints are going to run a 3-4, they're going to have to get some new personnel. I don't know that there's a pure nose tackle on the roster right now. You mentioned Brian Bresee earlier, Luke. I have him pictured here because he's a big question mark. He's a very useful player. Where does he fit in this scheme? There's question marks just about everywhere on that defense, especially up front.
Yeah, I think that was going to be the case no matter what, whether they were in a 4-3 or a 3-4. That front needs some work. I don't think it's out of the question their linebacker core needs some work. Steve Werner just signed an extension, but Demario Davis is he's in his mid-30s. Had good numbers last year, but I don't think anybody would argue that was the same Demario Davis we'd seen the previous couple of years. Really needs some help at defensive tackle outside of Bresee, who at this stage of his career is really still just kind of a one-trick pony. And I guess I should say that even if they are running a 3-4 here, he'll definitely have a role as like a sub pass rusher. I just don't think that's going to be what they initially envisioned him being when they drafted him in the first round. I just think that there's a lot of need at those 7 positions that we're talking about here, front 7. I think you could just kind of go up and down the line and say they could use somebody pretty much everywhere.
And not just those 7. There's a lot of needs on this roster, and
of course.
Yeah. But I know we're specifically talking about this, but I do think you hear a lot of people say they need O-line help or they need skill help. I agree with you, Luke. I think now whether it's the first pick or not at some point in the draft, Matt, Jeff, if you guys want to chime in here, they absolutely need to address D-line, and I think that this just highlights that issue even more.
Yeah, I think unfortunately for the Saints, a guy like Mason Graham is going to be gone by the time they pick at number 9, but if he was there, he's I think would be a home run for them in terms of getting a versatile defensive tackle who's big and can fill up some holes for them. But even then, you look at their edge rushers, I mean, Carl Granderson was again probably their most consistent edge rusher. Maybe Chase Young was, but he's a free agent and didn't necessarily have the sacks to reflect the amount of pressures that he had. Cam Jordan had a nice push to end the year, but who knows? Like their defensive end, like it's weird because the defensive ends were maybe like not the deepest position on the roster, but at least you felt fine about them overall, but they still lacked that true star. Like you had a bunch of B's and no A's, sort of thing. So that's a group that really needs some juice.
Yeah, and I think highlighting all of this, Dunk, is like the backdrop of the salary cap issues. You can't just go get somebody to plug a hole. To a certain extent, they're stuck with what they've got because they're going to have to. I mean, this ties into the Derek Carr discussion, but you're going to have to restructure possibly some other contracts too and keep guys around.
Yeah, I mean, they're so limited, I think, in what they can do in free agency because of the cap. So that's where I think this challenge that Kellen Moore has in some ways is actually more difficult than, say, what Peyton had to face in 2006 because they just weren't dealing with cap issues that are going to hamstring their player acquisition. I think they're just going to have to go young and draft a bunch of guys. And Luke's pointed this out before, I think. For whatever reason, Loomis has always wanted to, their strategy of trading up and targeting guys, and you end up with fewer draft picks. I'm not sure that's the way to go where they're at right now. They may be better served with just a bunch of young guns, try and play a bunch of young guys on defense and build from there. And I don't think that's a bad strategy because I've always been a big fan of Jeff Ireland. I think their college scouting staff is good. They've shown historically they can find guys in the mid to late rounds that can be productive. So we'll see how this thing goes. But I think getting younger and more athletic on defense is a must this offseason.
Yeah. And it's why, like, I'm just going to, like, have an auto response ready for, like, the first person, when I put out a mock draft that says they need this, they don't need that. I'm like, they need everything right now.
Right.
Like, they shouldn't draft a receiver. It's like, well, they need one. They shouldn't draft they need to draft a tackle. It's like, yeah, well, they need a defensive tackle too. They take the best player available, maybe with the exception of running back. I think Ashton Genty's going to be there at 9 probably for them if they really wanted to go that route. But I think he's the only one I'd say, like, he'd be really fun. I'd really love to see him in a Saints uniform. But, like, you got, like, 30 other needs. Like, don't take that one.
I was going to say that edge rusher feels as big of a need for them as tackle did last year. But I don't know if I could actually say that given their needs all over the roster. Like, in a vacuum, it feels like it is. But you look at the Saints' entire roster and they need some talent upgrades.
You could tell me tackle is a big need this year too.
Sure.
Because, like, I think it's totally within reason for Kellen Moore and that offensive staff to look at Trevor Penning and be like, you're an awesome run blocker. You're a major work in progress as a pass blocker. Let's see what you can do at left guard, where we have a hole in our roster. And if Will Campbell's there, who maybe he's a better guard at than tackling, I think you give yourself some options: left tackle, right tackle, left guard. So I just think there's so many different ways this can go, which is going to make next week very interesting.
Yeah, and look, Kellen Moore was in Philly last year when they moved Becton, who'd been a tackle his whole career to guard. He made a great transition. So you can do it. We've seen it done around the league. Makes a lot of sense. And the other thing I thought was interesting, just looking back at Brandon Staley's background, his first year with the Chargers, he drafted Rashawn Slater with the 13th pick, who's obviously been a great pick. And then he took Asante Samuel Jr., who's kind of an undersized corner, not the kind of guy the Saints would have taken in the past. So maybe he doesn't have that same philosophy as far as size and length that the prototypes the Saints have looked for in the past.
I think he drafted he was there for Kenneth Murray too, right?
Yep.
I think so. Another 215-pound linebacker the Saints never would have taken. So
yeah, a very, very interesting discussion, and leads into the combine next week, where Matt and Luke will be kind of checking out these prospects, and we'll see where they go. Who else is going to be there? That's another question. We haven't heard a lot of noise on defensive assistants joining Brandon Staley's staff. Do you guys have any names at all, or even who makes sense if you haven't heard the buzz, who could be filling out this staff the rest of the way?
Yeah, I think there's one name to watch out for, and that's former Florida Gators and Miami Hurricanes defensive backs coach Will Harris. Not the same as a safety Will Harris with the Saints, but that's somebody who was on Brandon Staley's staff before with the Los Angeles Chargers, and he's apparently told everybody he's going to coach in the NFL this year, and it's not really out yet where that's going to be. So I think there's only a couple landing spots left for that to be. So I would kind of almost expect him at this point. But outside of that, I mean, it's kind of tough, right? They're going to be like basically looking for coaches who are out of work right now. Or who, their teams don't want to retain, teams that have been like, yeah, you can go ahead and seek work. So, I'm sure that the work has already been done, like reaching out to those guys, engaging their interest and everything like that. But it's, kind of clock's ticking on this, the combine being next week.
Right. And like, I think maybe one of the things Luke and I will have to do is just pull up a list of the 2023 Chargers staff and see which one of these guys like don't have jobs yet, because another one, like Jay Rodgers was the Chargers defensive line coach, and he was just let go by the Falcons. I don't know if you want to bring the Falcons defensive line coach in after they underwhelmed, but he's a guy who has ties to this staff anyway.
Is Ryan Nielsen employed right now?
I don't think so.
Did he stay on with the Jaguars?
He's joining Buffalo.
Ah, okay. All right.
McDermott.
On that.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's a game of musical chairs, and a lot of guys have already found their chair. Now, on the other hand, the Saints have some of the only open chairs left. So if you are looking for a job, the Saints may get the best of those guys left. But it's going to have to be done quick. You guys are going to have to learn some faces in Indy next week and find out who's hanging out with these guys. So that's kind of what to expect in the next week or so. We're going to see, first of all, the assistant coaches filled up, and then we're going to start to see these personnel moves. Who do they restructure? We had the big podcast on Wednesday about Derek Carr, and that's obviously the major domino that needs to tip over in one direction or the other, and will really decide how the Saints attack the rest of the offseason. Because if you don't have Carr, I would think you need to bring somebody in instead of just handing the job over to Spencer Rattler, without any competition at all. That would be strange. So those are the next steps. I do want to talk about one more thing before we stop here, and that's the idea that Brandon Staley, as a former head coach, it's an interesting dynamic. Not a lot of first-time head coaches have this guy who they just worked for. I mean, you mentioned this at the top, Matt, that he just worked for Staley 2 years ago. Now Staley's working for him. Do you think that's beneficial to Moore? How does that relationship work in your eyes?
Yeah, I would say that, I mean, one of the things Ron Rivera would always talk about in Washington, ring the bell, is how when he was hired by the Carolina Panthers, one of the biggest mistakes he made in his tenure was not having a coach on staff his first year who had been a head coach before. And in Washington, when he got there, he hired Jack Del Rio. Didn't work out in the long haul, but they were actually very good defensively their first year. And even when Rivera was sick, Del Rio was someone to lean on who could run practices when Rivera had to miss time for cancer. Those are extreme circumstances, but I do think there is benefit overall to having someone who's been in that chair before, who can know what it's like to delegate. And just because they've worked together, they kind of know the rhythms of what they like offensively, defensively, like they've been in meetings before. That can help as you're trying to formulate a game plan or trying to scheme against certain opponents. They kind of have the rhythms of working with each other already, which I think will be helpful.
Yeah, I could even see a scenario, guys, where just the small things, right? Brandon Staley knows how the rhythm and the responsibilities of a head coach go throughout a mini camp or throughout training camp or throughout a game week. And Kellen Moore although probably has a pretty good idea at this point. Maybe there's something small that Staley says, hey, I know you need to go do that. Let me take this off your plate, or I'll take that off your plate. Maybe I'm overthinking this, but to me, there is a little bit of a benefit, maybe even for both guys here, where we talk about Staley going to just focus on the defense, but also Kellen Moore having a sounding board of how did you deal with the media on this, or these little things that head coaches have to deal with that we talk about, which is why some of them fail, honestly.
Yeah, look, and I think that's one of the reasons I know Saints fans far and wide are ready to run off Mickey Loomis, but I think having Mickey Loomis there is going to be good for Kellen Moore just because he's a veteran general manager, very well connected around the league. He's nurtured Sean Payton on his path to being a head coach when he came in as a first-time head coach, a young coach. So I think having Loomis in that role is certainly better than, say, if Kellen Moore was coming in with a first-time general manager and they both were trying to keep their head above water. I think it's a good fit here in New Orleans with a veteran front office.
And to your point, Zach, I do think that it's going to be beneficial for Kellen Moore having somebody who has been a head coach before there, because it's hard to see it from the fan side of things, and really even from our side of things, just like the big additional workload that goes on a head coach. Yeah, I mean, you're making decisions on everything, you're making decisions on like what your players are like wearing to practice and stuff like that, and that sort of stuff that can take a toll on somebody. And I think, not on everybody. There's some people they just deal with it just fine. Sean Payton had no problem dealing with that stuff. He was a first-time head coach. I don't think he had a former head coach on his staff. But like for some people, like when you start having to decide things and deal with things that are not strictly football related, and you're talking to the media 4 or 5 times a week, that's hard to deal with. And it's good to have somebody who's been there and has been through that and can let you know what to expect, to help you with that sort of thing. And I think we've seen a lot of successful first-time head coaches have somebody like that on their staff, and most notably Sean McVay with Wade Phillips.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll wrap things up. Kellen Moore has hired Brandon Staley as his defensive coordinator. He has Doug Nussmeier as his offensive coordinator. He's basically got an offensive staff. We're still waiting on the defensive staff, but these were the 2 names that we heard as soon as Kellen Moore was hired as the Saints. And in fact, even before he was hired, we were talking about Nussmeier and Staley during Super Bowl week as possibilities. So a little bit the opposite of the head coaching search hire, where Kellen Moore was not one of the first names mentioned. He went out and got his guys. That has to be a good thing, I think. But how do you guys sum up the hiring of these coordinators? And we can add in Phil Galliano as special teams coordinator. How do you sum it up, or how do you grade how Kellen Moore has filled out his top lieutenants?
Yeah, I would say it's a B+, A-, like that. They seem pretty solid hires. Nussmeier's never been a coordinator before, but he's a coach that knows more from stop to stop, and Kellen will be calling plays anyway. Staley's an experienced voice who's been a coordinator and also a coach. And the one thing is, this is a really young staff, and I wonder if that inexperience will hurt them at all. But they've also, as young as they are, they've also been in the NFL for quite a while. So, we'll see.
Yeah, I'm with Matt. I give it high marks. I don't know if I want to give it a letter grade, but I think Staley hire is really good. The one time we've seen him as a defensive coordinator, it was really, really good. They obviously don't have Aaron Donald on this team, but I think that still speaks highly as to what he is as a coach. I think Nussmeier is as solid as you're going to get for a non-play calling offensive coordinator. Obviously somebody who, it'll be fun watching him be down here working about 70 miles away from his son playing quarterback at LSU. I imagine we'll see him in a couple college football games on Saturday too. So I think that's it's all good to me right now. I think the big question they're facing now is how they put the roster together that these guys are going to coach.
Yeah, no doubt. And to be clear, and I know we appreciate the B+. It's a little early for letter grades. I get it, but I do think, Jeff, if you want to wrap it up, like I think Kellen Moore so far, 2 weeks in, has done here what he came to do. Now the real hard part begins.
Yeah, the thing I like, and we talked about it earlier, is he's got a young staff, and I think that's going to be important. This job is going to be a big challenge, and I think they're going to need a lot of energy, a lot of enthusiasm, and you got a young staff that's probably eager to prove themselves in new roles. Kellen Moore's never been a head coach. You know, you got chip on your shoulder if you're Brandon Staley, get another chance to be a coordinator. So there's a lot for these guys to take advantage of this opportunity, and I think it's going to be important for these guys to be hungry and have a lot of energy, because they're not going to have more talent than a lot of the teams they're playing. I think we know that. But this job is going to require, I think, young, enthusiastic guys, and that's what they've got. And I think that was probably a big part of Mickey Loomis's strategy in making this hire.
All right, so that's going to do it for us today. We appreciate you joining the Saints Insider Podcast, a live edition here on this Friday. We'll be back with you next week. Matt and Luke will be in Indianapolis for the Combine, but Dunk, maybe you, me, and Rod will get together and talk about something at some point. Maybe we'll talk about a hockey team in New Orleans. You want to do that?
Yeah, that's a great idea. I mean, have we got that team yet? Is we broken that story? Is it?
I think we're just waiting on the logo and the colors.
Yeah, we secured it, right? I know. And then we're going to work on the pro beach volleyball team after that, I think. Maybe team bowling.
Yeah, heavy with sarcasm for those who can't tell. Please don't go saying Jeff Duncan saying NHL team is coming, because I think he's saying the opposite. But Matt, Luke, you guys enjoy Indy, and we're going to be back on the Saints Insider next week. You can keep it locked to the Saints on NOLA.com YouTube channel. Hit the like button, subscribe, leave a positive review on the podcast platforms, Apple Podcasts or Spotify. We appreciate that. And you can find all of our work at NOLA.com/Saints. Until next time, thank you so much for watching.